They told me later that the morning had been ordinary. To everyone who watched the footage afterward, to those who read the headlines, it began like any other workday in that city, machines whirring, phones ringing, and the distant soundtrack of a metropolis that refuses to sleep. But truth be told, and I say this with all the weight my voice can hold, for me that morning stretched differently. It felt like the hinge of a door in time, one breath on one side of it and another breath on the other. I had been a driver for more years than I care to count. I knew the schedule of the building, the habits of the employees, the smell of the coffee that someone always left on the 8th floor counter. My name is Michael. I'm 53. I keep a tidy life, church on Sundays, small repairs in my free time, a family that keeps me steady. The job at the production company put me at the pulse of life, people coming and leaving, stories being told and made into films. It was the sort of place where you learn to remember a face and forget the gossip. I liked that. That morning I had polished the headlights and felt the sun press down warm as I parked. I watched staff trickle in, some laughing, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. By 9 we were fully awake, by 10, on deadline. I had no inkling that the ordinary rhythm would break. I had no inkling of the sound that would change the texture of my bones. The first distant shout, dismissed by many as a road row, the way a city always has noise. Inside the building we joked about small things, the cooler making a noise, someone's trousers splitting in a comical way, the assistant who always misplaced his phone. I remember the little alarms of normal life because they are the tragic contrast to the siren that came later. I remember the creak of the elevator and the smell of the photocopier. I remember the staircase tiles that night would later be stained with ash. Ordinary things matter because miracles and tragedies alike always arrive inside ordinary frames. Around mid-morning the first sign arrived, a tremor of panic outside. At first we thought it was a traffic accident. Then we heard voices, and the voices were not like the city's ordinary. They were raw and sharp, carrying a heat I felt against my cheek even though I was inside. Someone peered through the window and shouted a single word that multiplied into many, "Run." We did not run yet. There was confusion, disbelief. People called loved ones. A manager told us to stay calm. We were told the perimeter was secure. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to hold on to the knot of routine. I kept my hand steady on the steering wheel, imagining I would wait for my boss, take him home, and return to the hum of deadlines. I thought of the small things of life and did not know that those small things were about to be rearranged forever. Everything that morning was ordinary until suddenly it wasn't. The moment you realize normalcy is gone is never cinematic in the way you see on film. It is microscopic and then enormous, a close breath and then the sky opens. If you had asked me in that hour whether I believed God moved in everyday life, I would have nodded and quoted the Psalms with the faith of a churchgoer. If you asked me then whether I expected to be tested, I would have laughed without thinking. I did not yet know that a man's whole theology can be challenged before noon. When the first smoke threaded into the windows, that ordinary morning fractured into sections you cannot put back together, before the noise, during the scramble, and the after that never stops. I can still feel that hinge. At first anyone would have confused it for chaos that sometimes spills out into the street, a protest, a rally, another angry argument in a city that has history and sharp edges. The shouts were impossible to miss. They leapt through windows and down corridors, a rising tide. Men and women in the reception hid beneath desks. Someone tried to calm the crowd with announcements that sounded thin against the roar outside. Our security guards were brave and they tried to hold the gate, but bravery in numbers often meets a force that moves in a different magnitude. It is important I say this plainly, what happened was violent. It was not a civil disagreement. It was an attack. They were a group that had come looking for destruction. The way I tell it, and the way I still tell it in my church, I call them a violent mob, because naming them that way keeps me from painting with broad strokes that could wound more than heal. I do not speak for an entire religion. I speak of a group of men and women who chose violence at that moment. That is what took place. Nothing in this story suggests that any whole faith endorses such acts, only that at that hour a number of angry people chose to act without mercy. The shouts outside were blended with something else, a metallic crack as gates broke, the hiss of tires and the pop as something flared. I smelled smoke, the acrid, chemical smell of burning rubber, the way heat makes the back of your throat ache. Then I saw the first car catch fire, the orange licks of flame reflected on the glass facade like a warning signal. When a crowd moves toward you with intent, your body senses the danger before your mind does. There is a peculiar slow motion to fear, your feet somehow know the path even while your brain says, no, not yet. People stream to stairwells and elevators. I saw faces I knew my whole life, children of colleagues, quiet assistants, staring with eyes wide, lips moving in prayer. Inside, on the higher floors, there was a surreal mixture of sound, people whispering verses, some speaking names of God in their own tongues, some shrieking, some trying to call for help. The faiths braided together in that space. Prayer was the only language that felt safe. I clutched at a booklet I kept in the glove compartment, a small pocket New Testament, and I kept repeating the Lord's Prayer under my breath. Maybe I thought repetition could make me invisible. Maybe I thought repetition could shield me physically. It didn't. But repetition steadied my hands. A colleague who had always been calm was suddenly shaking. He said he could hear men below shouting for specific persons, and that terrified us all. We never thought the mob would go floor by floor. We never thought they would take the time. The thing about hate when it moves, it's methodical. It has a logic of cruelty that tells those swept into it they are right. And when such logic shapes a crowd, they become more dangerous than the sum of their parts. The building's emergency lights blinked and failed under the heat. We were left half in emergency light and half in the amber glow of a spreading fire outside. Someone made a break for the roof, someone else headed for the back stairwell. I watched them go and thought then of exits as small, finite doors like hope itself. Fear is a teacher. It instructs you in the immediacy of truth. In that hour, all the philosophy and lectures and verses I had recited for years became practical requests. Who will save me? Is God near? Do I even know how to call him? Those questions were ugly in their honesty. They demanded answers I did not have prepared for a morning that had been ordinary an hour before. We prepared for the worst because we had to. We barricaded doorways with chairs. We broke windows to breathe. And amid all that, in the middle of thunder and the sound of people who had chosen vengeance, I felt the small quiet voice in my chest, not from my mouth but from somewhere else, telling me to be still. People around me called it resignation. I called it prayer. The stairwell smelled of smoke and ozone, every breath tasted of heat. We had stacked chairs against the doorways as makeshift barricades and prayed that they would be enough. We frayed thin ropes of fabric into a signal flag and waved it from the window, hoping someone outside would see it and not think it was a provocation. Forgive the impracticality of such thinking now, but rationality in panic is a very human attempt to regain control. We huddled as a group on the landing between floors. There were perhaps 20 of us there, shoulders touching, sharing the same little space of humanity that somehow refused to dissipate even under the pressure of fear. My hands were numb because the muscles around them refused to relax. A younger woman, perhaps 25, laughed at something a man whispered to her, a laugh that ruptured the tension and made us all feel briefly that we were still alive in the old sense of the word. That laugh is a thing I will always remember. Small human things anchor you. I remember thinking about that laughter when the first blows came. The mob, having taken the lower floors, pounded on the outer doors and on the windows. They shouted names, eventually calling out the name of someone we knew, one of our supervisors. The sound of their voices when they listed names was like a catalogue of threat. When someone knows your name and calls it, it is no longer a crowd, it's intent. The manager tried to arrange an escape by the rooftop, but the rear exit was engulfed. The elevator, as elevators do, became a trap. Smoke can move faster than reason. It seeped into our clothing. It made our eyes sting and our words fall into whispers. At a certain point a voice near me, my voice now, though I didn't know it at the time, said, "If they come through the floor, run to the window." It was almost like instruction and I obeyed on reflex. The window was cracked from earlier heat, we could feel the shake in its glass when someone outside threw a hard object at the pane. When the floor began to shake under the impact of their entrance, everything turned into a calculus of survival and an inventory of faith. The calculus said, "Find a way down." The inventory said, "What do I pack?" Not files or phones, the little prayers, the names of those I loved. I picked up my booklet, folded it in my palm, and I put it in my pocket. It felt weightier than it had before. There was a brief, insane calm when someone opened the door and shouted for us to come down. Panic doesn't always arrive in a flood, sometimes it appears as a door opening. What is odd is that the instruction to go down was not always shouted by the mob. On the 12th floor, the men who entered were not entirely faceless, some looked as if they had been told a story that made them invincible. When a group of them poured into our level, the heat of hatred became a physical force that knocked chairs over and pushed bodies. I had a choice in seconds that would ripple out for the rest of my life: choose to stay and possibly be killed upstairs, or risk whatever lay beneath. The instinct to live is as ancient as breath. I went to the window. In that small moment, my life narrowed to the breadth of a pane of glass and the height of 12 floors. I have no illusions about courage, I did not feel heroic. I felt as most men feel when faced with the abyss, a raw, animal, pleading desire to continue. We made plans in glances more than words. There was no time for debate. There was time only for the immediate. I knelt then and I whispered every verse I had learned in my childhood. I confessed to God the small things, the little selfish things I'd kept hidden, the moments I had failed my family in exhaustion, the times I'd been proud. I did not know if confession was a bargain, I only knew that in that hour the sound of my voice felt like a rope thrown into a storm. And then, because some decisions require a name, I said aloud the one I had been taught to say in times of need, Jesus. It felt strangely right to whisper that name. The building shook, the crowd screamed, and my hands were still. They came in waves. The attackers moved through the corridors with a clarity that was terrifying. When you see a person move with absolute conviction in their actions, a certain frictionless momentum appears, and they seem larger than the chaos surrounding them. They were loud, they were methodical. They kicked open doors, their footsteps sounding like hammers. I remember seeing one of them pause at a desk, pick up a family photo on the shelf, squint at it and then toss it aside. There was a spectacle to their violence that was chilling. They wanted more than destruction, they wanted to display it like a warning. They wanted us to know what it meant to be on the wrong side of their fury. At that point there were only a few of us left together. The people who earlier had laughed were gone, some had fled, some hid in small rooms. We were stripped to the essentials. I saw a colleague who always wore a gentle expression stand like stone, his jaw set. He picked up a metal bar and held it like a child might look at a sword in a storybook, understanding the gravity of the object but still trembling. He looked at me and mouthed, "Run." I nodded. Running inside a building that is on fire is not like running outside. Air pockets and heat currents change direction, smoke hides exits. As we made for the window, the one whose pane had been cracked earlier, we heard the sound of boots racing up the stairwell. The noise has a fever to it, it raises your skull as if the sound itself might break you. One of the attackers reached us first. He lifted his hand and there was a phrase muttered, something in a dialect I was not used to. His eyes were wild, not with the drunk frenzy of someone overwhelmed by rage but with cold, studied aggression. He looked at me for a long time, as if sorting me into a category that would determine my fate. I felt his stare weigh like an iron bar. My knees felt weak but I forced them to move. We edged to the window. I saw the faces of those below, people on the street gathering like vultures at a charred picnic, and I saw among them the one who would not let me die without intent. When one attacker moved toward me, the floor slipped like clear soap under my feet, I lost purchase, and in the chaos, a shove came. It was not a gentle nudge. It was a hard push aimed with the kind of cruelty that says, you must fall. When the body parts that make a life, your lungs, your bones, your heart, suddenly gather speed toward a precipice, you have a small, crystalline moment where the world clarifies itself to its simplest substance. For me that moment was 3 seconds long and an eternity. I thought of my children, of the small repair shop I had left in the care of a neighbor, of the words I had never said, and I thought of God in a way that is not scholastic but visceral. It is the kind of prayer that forms when the only thing you can do is call. There was a violent lurch and I went through the pain. The glass gave with a shout. It was the most abrupt sound I have ever heard. Then, for reasons I cannot explain with the language of physics, the world became a slow, humming silence. The fall began. In the moment you begin to fall, time is slippery and the details sharpen as if a camera lens were focusing. I felt the wind as a living thing, tugging at the clothes that had been mine for years. My body rotated, then righted. Fear, which had been a cold stone in my gut, melted into something that felt like acceptance. I did not scream. If I made a noise, it was a small prayer that left my lips like a bird released. Then, impossibly, the sensation altered. Instead of hurt, there was an easing, a sense of hands beneath me. I cannot describe that easing without borrowing the language of grace. It was palpably gentle. It was a presence that took the fall and made it something other than a doom. The world around me filled with light that was not blinding but warm, as if someone had wrapped me in cloth made of sunbeams. That is when I heard it, not in a voice like a person speaking across a room, but like a word placed within my chest, hold. And I felt held. If you ask me to be clinical about that moment, about how physics failed and faith rose, I cannot. I can only tell you what washed over me, a peace so pure that it felt like arriving home. In the middle of the sky, surrounded by smoke and papers and the panic-thin cries of people below, I found a stillness I had never known. It was not that I hovered like a cartoon character who defies gravity, rather, everything in that moment refracted into a new configuration. The wind slowed. The paper that had whirled around me now orbited my head like small moons. The golden light that formed beneath me took no shape of finger or hand that imitated a human palm, instead it was an essence, an architecture of brightness that supported me. I perceived it as a hand because we humans think in hands. My mind created an image to understand the divine act. There was another sensation then, intimacy. I had always prayed at church for peace, for guidance, for a safe family. But this was the sort of intimacy that says, I know you. I have walked every step with you, including the ones you thought you walked alone. Names and faces and songs I had forgotten came into my head, my mother's voice, a hymn from the church when I was a boy, the smell of bread from my sister's kitchen. I felt seen in a way that did not document guilt or list sins but simply recognized a life. In that mid-air hold, I remember thinking of a verse I had heard as a child, He will not let your foot be moved, He who keeps you will not slumber. It was not merely an old religious line, it became a truth that beat in my ribcage. I understood, in the most primary way, that someone or something beyond the visible had intervened. I knew then, with a clarity that is difficult to put into words, that my life had been spared for a reason. The world held its breath. Below me, people screamed and wept. Somewhere men cursed. Above, the amber cloud refracted and made halos over the burning cars. I did not feel physical pain. I felt a profound, overwhelming mercy. The feeling was merciful in a way that rendered me speechless. If miracles must have a sound, then this one was silent. If they must have color, this one was the color of warm wheat and burned amber, and if they must have temperature, it was the comfortable heat of a neighbor's hearth. Then, in a movement too gentle to be mechanical, I began to descend, not as a punishing fall but as a landing. The light moved like a soft platform beneath my feet. It shaped itself to cradle me and then, almost as if complying with a quiet instruction, lowered me to the ground. When my feet touched earth, the sensation was like waking from sleep with a knowing, the world was the same, yet I was different. I tasted air and it was miraculous. Sounds returned at once with a violent clarity. My ears heard sirens, the crackle of flames, the people who had been running come to a halt as if rained. Those who had been in the street began to gather, looking at me as if I were a drifted object they could not explain. Faces registered shock. I could see the hands of a few men lift as if to help, and in the crowd there was one who ran through and knelt beside me. He was a stranger then, a man who had been driving by and had seen me fall. He ran forward without hesitation. He had the look of someone who did not plan to be hero and therefore did it naturally. He pulled me from the ground, spoke quickly into a phone, and then, with rough kindness, helped me into his car. He did not ask questions about why, only how and whether I was breathing. In his eyes I saw the common mercy that binds human beings even apart from faith. He did not need theology to be merciful. In the following hours, the story around my fall would be told again and again with variations. People would speculate, reporters would hunt for angles, public figures would make statements. There would be church sermons and social media threads and video footage that tried to explain physics with slow motion. I will allow those explanations their place. The only part that matters to me is the thing that happened in the sky and then in my chest. I was held. I was spared. It is easy for someone untouched by such a moment to ask skeptically, why was he spared and the others were not? I cannot and will not pretend to have an answer that satisfies every question about justice and mercy in a world where suffering exists. All I can do is tell you what I experienced and the change that experience made in me. I came back to life with the knowledge that I had been given a second chance. I would not waste it. The man who pulled me from the street, his name I learned later, was not an actor or a preacher. He was a carpenter named Samuel, with sawdust in his hair and kindly, practical hands. Some moments in life are too large for your memory to hold cleanly, some details blur until only the emotion remains. But certain things he did remain clear, how he pressed a shirt to my brow, how he whispered words I could not pick up, how he called for a taxi and then drove me himself when none were available. I remember the inside of his small car more vividly than I remember hospital walls. The dashboard glowed with cheap blue lights and a small tin of mints sat at his elbow. He drove with a deliberate calm that suggested he had done this before or that he was simply the sort of man who did not let panic steer him. The streets were worse then than when I had arrived that morning. Smoke hung like a veil over the city, and people clustered in doorways, watching the aftermath as if it were a live broadcast of their worst nightmares. On the ride, I had the first real time to speak. I tried several sentences and most of them came out as sobs. Samuel only listened. "It's all right," he said. "You're with someone now." His voice held the practical concern of a neighbor. He did not bring up God. He did not need to. I felt my tongue put together the words like a tool in work. They threw me from the window. It sounded unreal even to me. He drove me to a small clinic first. The doctor there was brief and businesslike. No broken bones, he told us after minutes of quick inspections, patting my limbs and asking simple questions. I remember thinking how odd it was that the body that should have been in pieces was whole. The doctor's clinical face did not allow for miracle talk. He said, "Unexplained," in the way professionals say, "unexplained," when their training meets an anomaly. Samuel wanted to take me to his house, but I wanted to see my family. My hands trembled as I spoke to them by phone. My wife's voice broke when she answered. My son did not know how to contain his fear. How do you tell family what has happened without turning their whole world? I told them I was alive. I told them I had been caught. It was the closest I could make that sentence to truth at the time. By midday the news vans had arrived. The story had become a headline by then: "Man falls from building, walks away." Reporters circled like birds. I felt exposed in a way I had never expected. Samuel stayed with me through the commotion, refusing the offer of money from a journalist who wanted to pay for the exclusive. He said, "No, I would not want that if it were my brother." That implacable decency sealed in me a gratitude that was not merely gratefulness for being alive but gratefulness for what ordinary human goodness can do in the face of horror. Later, when I spoke at the hospital and the doctor confirmed there were no fractures, there were murmurs and then tears among those who listened. Some wanted to find an explanation, some wanted to find a lesson. I wanted to find God in the way a thirsty man finds water. I had the sensation then of being both a physical body and a story that had been rescripted. Samuel asked nothing in return but a simple request: if you live, help someone else. That request became my lodestone. I owed him my life in 100 practical ways, not only for the ride but for the fact that a living, breathing neighbor chose to act instead of flee. The goodness in that choice changed me as much as the miracle itself did. There is a peculiar loneliness that comes with being the only survivor. People approach you with reverence or suspicion. Priests and politicians and journalists kiss the same shoes but with different motives. Some ask for details in the tones of investigators, others ask in the tones of those searching for meaning. I had to learn to hold all of those conversations with a steadiness I did not yet have. The police did their work, filling out reports, taking statements, talking about suspects. The morgues filled, and families grieved. Photos appeared in newspapers and online. The chair I had once sat in at the office became a symbol of something far larger than itself. Evangelists argued my survival as proof of divine favor. Skeptics said luck and physics were enough. I let them all speak. It did not change my bones or the ache in my chest. Inside me, battle raged. Guilt threaded through my days like a stubborn vine. How had I, of all the people there, escaped with skin intact? Why had the others not been spared? That question came to rest on my soul like a rock, and many nights I could not bear it. I would kneel and ask God the blunt human questions people sometimes refuse to ask their Maker: why did you choose me? Why were they taken? What am I supposed to do now? The answers did not come in tidy parcels. But in church, in the voice of my pastor, in the quiet hands of those who visited, I found a direction: live so their memory counts. I returned to the ruins a week later. The building was a black skeleton, still smoking in places. The sight took a breath out of me. I walked slowly through what had been my workplace and found small things that spoke of human life: a child's drawing pinned to a cork board, a half-burned calendar with a date circled, a coffee cup with lipstick on the rim. The details are seared into me, not for voyeuristic reasons but because they are proof that ordinary people once occupied that space. We were not abstract numbers. Each person had a life. My survivors' guilt sharpened. The church held vigils for the victims. People gave testimonies. They spoke of grief, of anger, of forgiveness. Some called for justice, some begged for peace. I stood at the back of one such vigil and listened as stories threaded together. The faces in the candles were slowly replaced by resolve. How do you make meaning in the aftermath of a tragedy? I do not have a single answer. But I know this: when grief is shared it does not disappear, but it does shift towards something that can be carried. The first time I stood before my church to testify, my voice did not feel like mine. It felt like the instrument of every man and woman who had lost someone that day. I told them the facts shrunk to the human scale: the fear, the fall, the light, the stranger who saved me. Many of them cried. Some shouted hallelujah. Some looked toward the ceiling as if to make contact with the mercy that had touched me. Some people have said that miracles are political. They argue that if one person is saved while others die, the narrative can be used to inflame or to comfort in ways that are not always healthy. I understood that complexity and still chose to testify. Not to inflame, not to boast, but because silence would have been a betrayal of the hands that reached for me and of those who did not live to tell their stories. Testifying is my duty now, not to the cameras or the headlines, but to memory. When the pastor put a microphone into my hand that Sunday, I expected to stumble and shame myself. Instead, words poured out with a clarity I had not owned before. I told the congregation how I had woken up on the pavement with the dust in my nose and the tingle of miracle on my skin. I told them how a golden presence, whether you call it angel or spirit or simple mercy, had steadied me in midair. I told them about the carpenter who had driven me and the doctor who had said, unexplained. I told them how my knees had buckled not from the fall but from the weight of what had been asked of me, to live, to remember, to serve. I told them that I did not know all the answers and that the lack of answers had only deepened my faith. The truth weakened the arrogance that comes with certainty. It also opened a path for service. People came to me afterwards, my pastor, my friends, strangers who had watched the footage, each with a different way of touching the miracle. Someone pressed a card into my palm offering counseling. A mother thanked me for the courage to stand. A young man asked whether I believed he could be saved too. I told them that my testimony was not magic but an invitation. You are loved. You are seen. If I was caught when I fell, maybe there is a reason to wake and act. I started small. I organized a group to go into neighborhoods and simply be with people who had lost their loved ones. We offered practical support, food, small funds, and attention. We also listened. It is remarkable how healing can begin when someone feels heard. The carpenter's single request for me to help someone in return became the engine of work. The call to repair was not only for broken roofs or leaky pipes but for broken hearts and fractured communities. Sometimes I am angry. Sometimes I weep in the quiet when no one sees. The lack of final answers visits me like a tide. But then someone writes to say they quit the path of hate because they heard my story. Or a young man in my neighborhood returns to church after years away. These are the small lights that confirm the miracle was not just for me but for others. When children ask me, with the pure eyes of those who have not yet learned fear, Michael, were you scared? I tell them the honest thing, yes. But after that day I also learned courage. Courage, I explain, is not the absence of fear but the decision to move when fear is the loudest voice. If you watch this and think only of spectacle, you will miss the point. This is not a story of stunt like walking away from destruction. It is a story of mercy that asks for human response. I believe the miracle is not simply that I survived. The miracle is that survival calls for something: service, love, witness. That is the work I have taken up. That is why I speak. I stand now before you and I say, do not let the noise of headlines harden your heart. Let the mercy soften it. If a stranger can risk his day to save another, what can we do with the simple gifts of our time and hands? I live to answer that question in small ways every day. And when my days are done, I want those hands to be full of the work I did in response to the miracle that saved me.